Okay, welcome everyone. We're hearing throughout this week at Davos, not just the broad theme of trust, but the challenge of creating a digital ecosystem where the public can trust what they see, what they hear, who they're going to meet in this environment. And we've been learning about many of the problems of that. And in some ways, there's already a kind of search for the guilty. Who's guilty? We've got a fabulous panel of people who think about these things. I'll introduce them in a moment. This session is called Safeguarding Digital Spaces. That's what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at whether it's possible to come together to create a better, safer internet in all its different guises. We may well talk more broadly about many kinds of harmful content. I think we should try and do that. My panelists are very, very interested in that. But I think we're going to begin and focus significantly on, if you like, one rather clear-cut example. Many of the issues like fake news or misleading political ads fire up all sorts of tensions about freedom of speech and all the rest of it. But the safety of children on the internet is a real issue. And in fact, it was thought of as an issue back in the 1990s. This is not a new problem. It was identified in the 1990s that this wonderful new world, generally there was a sense of utopia at this point about the internet, but a sense that children will be vulnerable to abusive action and abusive content. Legislation, the Child Online Protection Act in the United States, for example, passed in 1998. So understood as a problem in the US, in the European Union. Look at this. The internet is overrun with images of child sexual abuse. What went wrong? Child abusers run rampant as tech companies look the other way. Video games and online chat rooms are, quote, hunting grounds for sexual predators. Now, these aren't the headlines from the 1990s that led to that legislation. This is coverage from recent weeks and months in the New York Times, as it happens. Other people have been doing work, but we've been doing some reporting in this area. For some reason, decades after this was identified as an issue, it's still a live problem. If you worry more generally about content on the internet, the fact that something which seems so clear-cut, where the policymakers, the parties, the platforms, the wider world all agreed about it, here we are, this is where we are. It remains an enormous problem. So to discuss this, but also maybe to draw some lessons for this for the broader issue of the management and the culture of content on the internet, we've got a great panel. Joanna Rubinstein is President and Chief Executive Officer of, I guess, the US branch of the World Childhood Foundation, one of the world's great global foundations, totally focused on safety for children, both in the physical world, but also in this world. Next to her, we've got Rohit Chopra, is one of the 5 commissioners of the Federal Trade Commission. Perhaps not everyone knows this, but in addition to all its antitrust responsibilities, the FTC has got extensive responsibilities for consumer safety, and specifically responsible for, I mentioned that American Act, COPA. The FTC is charged with the enforcement of COPA. And Rohit, I know because we've talked before, is deeply interested in this topic and the complex factors which are leading to these problems. And finally, I'm very pleased also to welcome, I should say, now Vice President Vera Jourová of the European Union, with a particular responsibility for values and transparency. But before that, I first met you when you were the Justice Commissioner. And Vera, again, has got not just broad responsibilities, but I know a passionate and broad interest in these topics. But Joanna, perhaps I can begin with you. And can you scale the problem for us? I mean, how big is this problem? And can you help us with this basic question, which is, given how clearly it's been identified, what is stopping a solution?
Well, I wish I had an answer to what is stopping the solution. Firstly, I would really like to thank you, Mark, and the New York Times for an incredible investigative journalist job you have done to put this topic on people's agenda. And I have to say that it really had an impact globally, not just in the US. Many people read New York Times. and it was recognized as a problem, a global problem. Otherwise, in most of the conversations, we normally don't talk about children, not as business, but often not as governments either. So in this particular case, highlighting something that it's so prevalent really made the difference, and doing it through New York Times. So thank you for that. But what it showed is that not only is it a big problem, and we knew about it very early on with internet, this problem is growing. And as you rightly pointed out in your articles, 2018, there were 45 million of pictures and videos of child sexual abuse material online that were reported by the companies. Well, a year before, there were 16 million, 2017. We don't have the numbers for 2019 yet, but it clearly shows that with the expansion and the the better connectivity that we have and the better devices, every device has a camera. Every child can even take pictures of themselves. This becomes a huge problem. And the other challenge is, like, unless we try to identify these pictures and take them offline, and unless we as a society are aware of this problem, which exists in the real world, because in the real world we have between 10 to 20% of all the children in the world being sexually abused before the age of 18, and in most cases around 90% by someone they know. So we don't see that problem. We consider this as a family problem. Online, it's our problem. We all have that problem, and we need to address it.
And do these two worlds interact? I mean, in other words, do you think the ubiquity of this content online actually encourages and facilitates real-world abuse?
Absolutely. Before, you can think about a pedophile. They had to groom children. They had to meet children. They had to find a way. Nowadays, a pedophile can have hundreds of children he's grooming. It's mostly men, and online, and then can actually start interacting with a child. These are not digital children, and these are not digital offenders. We are talking about real people. We just use the connectivity and the internet and social media platforms as an enabler of that crime, because it's considered to be a crime.
And in addition to childhood, your main job, you've also been heavily involved in other efforts, and indeed global efforts, to address issues of child safety. But particular, tell us a bit, you were on a task force with, I think, pretty much everyone involved. So just talk a bit about, in a sense, because this is an example of many different people coming together. It's very kind of, to us, World Economic Forum idea of get all the parties together, working group, new guidelines, new suggestions. Talk about that.
So there is a Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development that's co-chaired by International Telecommunications Union and UNESCO, and also by the President of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, and by Carlos Slim Helou from Mexico. And there are 54 commissioners who are some of the heads of UN agencies. We also have Facebook, we have Microsoft, we have Ericsson, we have Verizon, we have regulators. And it's a group that realized that with the expansion of the broadband to the developing world, we are going to have even more than 30% of children being the users of internet. They are going to be half of them, because that's where most children live. And how could we ensure that we can prioritize their safety online? Because it is a transformational tool that can bring education, access to healthcare, to markets. And we have seen it especially in the developing world. We know how it transformed our lives. So we want these kids to have those opportunities, but we want them to be safe. And the reason is also that there are very few resources on the ground to rescue these children, to persecute the perpetrators. So it's really an urgency. We need to address this problem. And the Broadband Commission established a working group on child online safety, and I had the privilege to co-chair it together with the CEO of Zain Operations, Scott Gegenheimer, with 20 of the 54 commissioners, and they all agreed that, one, we need to prioritize child safety, that every national broadband plan or digital plan has to have provision for child online safety. So we need to execute. Everybody agrees.
I was going to say, despite all this agreement, and including the platforms, I understand, were part of the conversation, agreed to it, we've still got a problem which is not just not going away, but seems to be worsening. Rohit, I mean, you have at the FTC, you have these very considerable enforcement responsibilities. I mean, this makes pretty bleak listening, doesn't it, for frankly, the world's regulators. What's going on, and why is it proving so difficult to not even eradicate, but to slow the growth of this kind of really appalling content online?
Yeah, well, I'm actually much more optimistic. There has been hate, abuse, and exploitation in our world forever, and there will continue to be. But this is one of the first times in history where it's profitable. YouTube, Facebook, all of these platforms.
Yeah, this isn't sounding that optimistic so far, Rohit.
But here's the thing. They benefit from some of this enraging content.
Yeah.
This surveillance-based advertising model that some of these platforms are built on means that the thirst for more and more and more data, including from our children, is unquenchable. Because this advertising model in some ways is a gambling business. They're trying to figure out how to get user behavior and monetize it. That model is not targeted at a demographic, it's targeted at an individual. So, of course, harmful content, hateful content, darker content is going to be amplified. We know that the algorithms that are powering recommendation engines and news feeds are obviously going to be designed to maximize profits for these firms. So I don't care how many content moderators you hire, maybe the problem is the business model. Maybe surveillance-based advertising, which is promoting and amplifying some of these harms, is the real issue. And I'm not arguing that advertising should end. I just think we need to start accepting the reality that this surveillance-based model and targeted advertising at an individual it can be inherently manipulative. So I think if we can get to the point where we start understanding that maybe the business model is the core issue, maybe we fix the business model rather than trying to push companies to hire hordes of content moderators, which I think in some ways is almost an impossible job to be successful at. So look, the FTC, we have recent enforcement actions included TikTok, included YouTube. YouTube was collecting data on children. It knew it was, and it was profiting off of it. We know that YouTube is a place where, ISIS has recruited new recruits, and I think we need to just really dissect this business model and understand the consolidation that has occurred across search, photos, all of these verticals. It is all feeding this advertising model, and I think that has serious implications for how regulators have to deal with it. And maybe it is going after that model and that consolidation directly.
And can we just talk about accountability? I mean, and to what extent, I think we're going to talk about responsibilities which go far beyond the platforms. There's a rather easy move this week in Davos and elsewhere to entirely blame a few large American companies for all the world's ills. But if we talk about the platforms, is the fact that in many instances the platforms enjoy principles of immunity, in the US, famously Section 230, but there are similar principles often apply in Western Europe, and most countries have got some version of this notion of platform immunity. Is that part of the issue? That the fear? I mean, one of the ways in which companies can be incentivized to take these responsibilities seriously is the risk of legal sanction if they don't. Well, is that an issue?
Yeah, I think the immunity under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is really incompatible with this type of advertising model. Newspapers, if they promote and publish fake content that is libelous, they are held accountable. And when you're profiting from the promotion of some of this content, and you can claim, oh, I don't know, it's an algorithm. Well, you should be responsible for that if that algorithm is designed with your bottom line in mind. So I am concerned about the assertion of immunity under Section 230, both in the United States and similar immunities around the world. And I think that needs to be high on the agenda for fixing it. And don't get me wrong, I believe in the concept of immunity for passive flows of information. If you're just a pipe, maybe you shouldn't have any immunity for what flows through it. But once you are profiting from the curation of it, I just think that's inconsistent.
So I mean, I find this line of argument persuasive, though. I think I want to say, if when we look at those stories about child abuse happening now and hear that this abusive content is growing, it would appear pretty rapidly right now. A solution which looks for a fundamental kind of reorganization of the economics of the internet doesn't feel like it's going to, as it were, within weeks or months, begin to stem or stop this sort of tide. Is there anything with really egregious examples of abusive behavior, abusive action relating to children? Is there anything that can be done, recognizing that there may well be fundamental adjustments wanted to be made to the entire economics of this ecosystem, and indeed to accountabilities? Are there any short-term measures that could be effective, do you think?
It's tough to say. I really think that this is obviously a problem we've been dealing with for a generation, and as technology evolves, the regulators and the public have to adapt to it. I think I get worried. We all saw last year Christchurch and how it just engulfed the internet through Facebook. And I think I'm most worried about what are the vehicles for which those who are perpetrating harm fan the flames? What are the vehicles that they used as a megaphone and as a way to spread hate and abuse more aggressively? So I think it's a challenge to balance all of this, but at the end of the day, I still go back to who is profiting from it and what can we do to fix that?
So Vera, Jourová, we should congratulate you on your new role at the Vice Presidency. We should also congratulate you on what sound like a terrifyingly broad range of responsibilities. For, in the broadest sense, transparency and safety and protection of democracy across Europe. And we know that in Europe, often there are parallel and often congruent but slightly different approaches and traditions in thinking about these questions. Could you just give me your reaction to the conversation so far and have a sense of what's your agenda? Anything specifically about safety of children in the digital space, but also more broadly on these content questions?
Thank you very much. I think that our approach is similar to the approach we just heard. Follow the money. I think it's one of the principles we will be strongly implying. In other words, we speak here about criminal activity. Yeah, this is crime. Producing the child sexual abuse material and distributing it's a crime. Distributing terrorist content and producing it's a crime. Hate speech, the same thing. It's the distance from America that there is the freedom of speech which has no limit. But you also start to speak about harmful content.
So just to spell that out, whereas under the First Amendment of the US Constitution, the United States of America takes a very strong position on freedom of speech and allows what most people would regard as hateful content, certainly, angry, vituperative, politically extreme content, enjoys extensive protection. You know, to be very broad, in Europe, there's traditions where, although there's significant respect for freedom of speech, compromises for other socially important things are allowed more frequently.
In Europe, the freedom of speech principle has the priority, unless it is not the content which is prohibited by criminal law. Criminal law in all the member states and in the whole Europe by some European legislation. So again, that's the criminal activity. And when we see simply that the evil sells better than the good, that the lie sells better than the truth, we have to act. And I think that to look into the business model and to take the measures against this is something which we plan. I'm also looking at it from the perspective of fake news. disinformation, legally speaking, it's not illegal. Lying is immoral. I think you will agree with me. It's not a nice thing, but speaking about criminal law, it's not illegal. But also here, we should find a way how to follow the money and how to cut the producers of the intentionally produced disinformation, which purpose is to harm the society, to cut them off the money. But coming back to the children, I don't know any better solution than smart and very well thought through combination of prevention and repression. And this is what we are doing in Europe. We have GDPR, where there is the parental responsibility. I think that we don't want to live in the world where Google is the mother and Facebook is the father. I think that so there is a job for the family and for the close people. We have audiovisual directive, which says that the content of this kind is illegal. We are preparing the new legislation which will impose more responsibility on the platforms for the content like this child abuse material. And we will also continue what we do on the repressive side. I travel around Europe with very strong alert for the police and prosecutors. Follow the cases when they are notified. Only through our network, which is called InHope, you can look at it. In 2018, there were 330,000 notifications, out of which 220,000 was really illegal. So the job for the police to follow the cases. The problem we have in the EU that the police finds out that the content is placed somewhere in another country. Yeah. And I really need to promote and to achieve the adoption of the regulation which I proposed 3 years ago already, that the prosecutor may ask the service provider from another country for expedite delivery of the evidence about crime. At this moment, with the traditional way of doing that, it takes, ladies and gentlemen, shameful 120 days. We cannot work like that. And while the criminals use borderless Europe, the law enforcement is trapped by the state borders.
So this is the criminal is flying a jet and law enforcement is getting on a horse, sort of thing. Yeah.
Or at least teeth.
And can I just add to the Vice President's comments? It's not just child abuse. The unlawful conduct is also all over commerce. I mean, in the United States, we have such a huge flow of counterfeit, unsafe goods, including toys for children, that flow in. A lot of it purchased on Amazon, and who can be held accountable for this? I mean,
from the 1st January in Europe, you can take down such websites. It's in the consumers' legislation and inspiration for.
And we're challenged because because those listings get taken down, and another illegal Chinese seller or seller from Hong Kong pops up. And
so replicants, as it were, pop up the whole day.
And I think this is something where it relates to responsibility of platforms. Are platforms promoting some of this counterfeit content? It spreads across the gamut. I have to tell you, one of the things that we have to be thinking about as Americans and Europeans is remedies. How are we going to hold some of these firms who are profiting from it accountable? When the FTC fined Facebook $5 billion, YouTube $170 million, the reaction on Wall Street and across the markets is, this is a drop in the bucket. And my own analysis showed that YouTube probably profited from it, even after the fine. So
and there's a risk of a kind of illusion of solution.
Yeah, it makes for a great headline.
A big fine, problem solved. So quite apart from the as it were, the lack of incentive or disincentive on arguably on the company, also maybe society thinks, well, you know, the system's working, the fines have been handed
Right.
out, and in fact,
The risk must be higher than the profit.
yeah.
Yeah, these fines are not a penalty, they're an incentive. I mean, I think that's why remedies, we're trying to think through as in the EU and the US about structural reforms.
Yeah.
You know, do we need to fundamentally address the internal conflicts of interest within these firms, whether the consolidation across all of these verticals actually creates a negative incentive, and that's what democratic institutions need to lead on. And I appreciate that, you know, business wants to be part of the table, but I don't think they're going to be too happy if a big piece of their profit model is at stake.
So although they should be involved in the conversation, they certainly shouldn't have a veto, is what you're saying, essentially.
Right. I mean, I think the armies of lobbyists and lawyers to crush some of these reforms, I don't think always shows good faith.
Okay.
I was thinking about the role of the private sector, and I'm not an expert on business models, but you know, we all believe internet is for free thanks to the business model that the companies actually pay for the data we put on the internet. So the other companies and the big brands have a role to moderate what gets on those networks because they may not want their brand to be associated with criminal activity. And there are cases where big brands have taken down partnership with certain or don't publicize or market their products on some of the platforms. So maybe I believe that nobody wants to harm children and everybody believes that children should be safe. And considering that they represent such a huge part of the users of internet and they are born into internet, that all the companies want them to be safe. And if they had a say that, okay, we're not going to market our products using that particular platform, maybe that platform will think about it because that would be much more money than your 5 billion long-term, losing your biggest customers. So that's one way. Another way, which we haven't discussed, is really the role of technology. The technology has made everything possible, and we have great algorithms, so we know exactly what to market to whom, but we have not been investing in technology that would prevent harm online. And because we didn't calculate, we didn't design those products to be safe per design so that the children couldn't be harmed. And I think that's an important step that we need to take to ensure before the products are out there on different platforms, what could be the consequences to children? So the safety should be at the highest level and then going down instead of the other way around right now.
You've talked earlier on about priorities and how high a priority this has been so far, and maybe had it been a higher priority, it would have been solved more quickly.
Yeah.
I just wondered, I mean, maybe, I don't know which of you wants to respond to this, whether I meet the leaders of these very big companies. I, for what it's worth, genuinely don't believe that they are in favour of this horrible content. I also think that, admittedly, within the context of what they're trying to do, this may well include the economic incentives that Rohit talked about, that they're trying pretty hard to find technical means and other means of reducing it. Is there any way, alongside ultimately tougher penalties, greater accountability and the rest of it, of encouraging those companies to work effectively on making this a higher priority?
Yeah, well, I have to say, you know, fossil fuel companies, they probably don't like climate change.
Yeah.
I mean, this thing they don't like, sometimes it's just a byproduct of their business. So I think unless there is pressure from Wall Street and other investor communities to say no more, because this is not a sustainable business model, and we need to fix it and change it. And the truth is I do believe that we want more tech and more services and more products, but the byproducts of some of it, I think it outflows from some of the business model. And look, with machine learning and AI, they know where children and teenagers are most psychologically vulnerable, and it can be exploited for profit. So I hope that they think about how is their business going to survive over the long term? I mean, in the 50-year horizon. And I think ultimately it's going to require not only them to step up, but it's more important for government leaders when it comes to antitrust enforcement, data protection enforcement, and a whole host of other criminal enforcement to hold them accountable. And let me just say it again, big fines are not big penalties for some of the biggest companies.
Just given the scale of their revenue. Can I come at this in a slightly different way and really talk about functionality and the fact that once you have a generation of young people, and indeed a population as a whole, who have devices which can very readily be used for both video and still images of themselves. Social media, which I suspect if these companies didn't exist, other ones would. Environments where the social pressure of children to be out there for, as it were, confessionally and other ways, exposing their lives to friends who they may or may not have met and have been sort of, in a sense, almost publicising themselves at scale. Irrespective of the economics of this, it's functionality which, at the very least, you'd have thought that parents, teachers, and other people who have a duty of care to the children might be doing a part in at least trying to help more children understand the potential risks and the dangers. I mean, it's kind of easy to point to Silicon Valley, but is there something fundamental about inside the family and in society about the potential dangers of these wonderful new devices and what they can do?
I have to say I'm of two minds. And as I stated before, these are wonderful devices that can bring so many good things to us. And I think there is a danger to just tell parents that they are very dangerous devices, because then they will prevent their children from using them.
But when we teach children about walking down the street and crossing the road safely, we're not saying
lights.
that
we have lights and we have police.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we need to have there.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we don't have right now.
The other thing is this data harvesting model online generates insights that no parent may even know. I mean, we've all seen these studies that, with knowing your likes on Facebook, someone can know more about you than your partner knows about you. And I think this is true. And so I'm not thinking about it solely in social media. The next wave is way more connected devices, wearable devices, and the fact that there may be devices that can learn such detailed information about the psychological state of adolescents, and then how will that be used to manipulate? And I think that figuring out how we can attack that and the consequences of it, because the truth is, there can be a business model where these devices are not primarily profiting from harvesting data, but actually from providing the service.
I get that. I guess the point I'm trying to make, Rohit, is there are circumstances we all know, particularly those of us who have children, know, where we have a narrative, understandably, you've been presenting it, of the kind of extraction of data against a business model from the public. Arguably, children interacting on the internet, they are very willingly, indeed intentionally sharing their data. I mean, so in other words, there is a straightforward, as it were, the actual consumer is actively choosing to do so, in some ways joyfully putting themselves out there as it were, in aid of social success, friendship, whatever it might be. And, although one side of it might well be the right incentives of the company, there's something about actually at the fundamental demand level, at the customer level, about if customers really want to do it, how do you make sure that they know what they're doing and what ultimate safeguards, traffic lights, and the rest of it you put in place? And I just wonder whether maybe, Vera, you could just to broaden it, a population across the European Union with these devices, with as a very strong incentives for many, many people to be online, to be putting themselves out there, a kind of wild west of business models and bad actors, and the great ease of kind of false flags of, being in one country, pretending to be in another country, actually being one person, one institution, pretending to be someone else. How big are the fundamental risks here, do you think, relative to the many other risks we're talking about, the climate, in terms of societal risks and political risks to democracy, and to, if you like, the rule of law that we're facing now?
I will give you a dry answer of a legislator, because we live in digital reality, which must not be the reality without the law.
Yeah.
And when we see that the people moved to the digital space, and a kind of, or as if they didn't take the laws and their rights with them, it's a dangerous situation, considering on top of that that this is a private space. Yeah, the space of the platforms, legally speaking, is a private space. So the role of the legislators, how we understand it in Europe, is to push the law there to follow the people. And that's why we came with the GDPR, which came to bring back the control over the people's privacy into their hands. And we came with the anti-terrorism directive, where we want the platforms and all those systems to remove terrorist content within 1 hour after it is notified. Yeah, notice and action, I think it's a system called. And we have several voluntary schemes, which you spoke about before. Because when I speak to the managers of the platforms and of the big tech, maybe I am naive, but I have always a strange feeling that as for the values, we are in the same circle. Speaking about American companies, to be concrete. Yeah. And only once I heard, and not from the biggest one, don't touch us, we are only the pipes. We don't have anything in common with the dirt which is in those pipes, only once. And it was a very minority opinion. All the others keep telling me, we feel responsible, so we voluntarily are going to do, to remove the notified hate speech within 24 hours and so on. And there is a very strong incentive for these voluntary agreements, because they know that in Europe we are very good in regulating.
Yeah,
And they don't want us to do it.
I think these issues have really, in many ways, been good for Europe and the US as a reminder of what is the role of government. There's been a lot of conversations these last few days about Facebook's Libra proposal.
Yeah.
And which, you know, what about money laundering? What about sanctions? What about all the things that we as government through the democratic process in the West safeguard our people through a sovereign function, the sovereign function of controlling our currency.
Yeah.
So I think this is something that we now realize there are certain things that government needs to be much more actively engaged in, and not just law enforcement, but also helping to create non-discriminatory safe infrastructure for the digital world.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, we'll take a couple of questions from the audience in a moment, if we can get ready for that. But just before that, I know you've got a point as well, but I just want to ask you, you just heard two, say, fairly positive regulators and legislators. Do you leave the meeting more optimistic than you came?
Yes and no. And I think what hasn't been mentioned, because at the end of the day, it's not about, it is about having legislation, and it's about having public highlighting that this is an important issue, absolutely, and that's why we're here today. But there are also solutions that nobody has worked on because children have not been really on the agenda. And I want to recognize that with the Sustainable Development Goals, we have a goal that talks about ending all forms of violence against children and exploitation by 2030. We do have companies like Microsoft, that was the PhotoDNA, was developed by Microsoft, I think 10 years ago, to track abusive material. Right now, Microsoft also released a tool which is tracking grooming process. And that's what we want. We want to make it, you know, not post factum, but prevention. I think it's the key, that we need to find also technology-driven solutions.
And is that deadline for the goal, 2030, a credible deadline for the kind of structural reforms and further legislative advances that the two of you are talking about? Is that?
In this field, we have much quicker deadlines in Europe. This new commission committed itself. This is a new commission, and we really want to come with workable solutions, both prevention, but also preparation for better law enforcement to tackle the issue of harmful content.
Okay, we'll take a couple of questions from the floor.
Thank you.
Or questions or comments, indeed.
No, a question. So I'm a parent of 2 children, as probably many others here today. I would like to ask you, tangibly, at a family level, what can we do to prevent, check, and control? Don't tell me, please, to speak with our children, because we do it. We've made them aware a lot, but it's not enough. Thank you.
I think general knowledge about which platforms we know are not safe for children, and the gaming platforms, so quickly identify, do they have unmonitored chat rooms that anybody can approach the child? But one thing that I learned more recently that I feel is very important for all the parents, we should not say, if they report any activity that sounds weird, our response is usually stop it, you are not allowed to use it. It's the reverse. We should really talk to the children and learn from them what is it they are experiencing. And there have been surveys that show that children feel that they would like their parents to be more involved in their online life. We ask them, what did you eat at school? What did you do at school? We don't ask them, what did you do online? And they want that, which is very interesting.
It is.
May I add?
Please,
yeah, I will not say speak to them. It was the first thing which I wanted to say. But I think that we should openly speak to the children about the danger which is there. And not to be hypocritical and to shy away. I think that it is a serious thing and it must be very clearly explained. And the second thing, to prepare another program for the children, to explain them the life is somewhere else. I am competing when I come home with the iPad of my grandson. It's a heavy work. It's a heavy competition, but I think the parents have to try to show them there are other spaces than digital.
Any more questions out there? Just in the front there. Yeah.
I was just wondering, as a follow-up, shouldn't we teach the parents more? Because arguably, I think they don't really know what's going on. They don't know the apps. They don't know what their children are doing. And maybe it's the first generation where the parents can't really teach them about the risks since they don't know it either. So what can be done here?
And can I just say that one thing it seems to me that more broadly, in some countries, we still teach civics, we still teach people a bit about government, about how government works. But is there not a case for a kind of a program of trying to help citizens understand, in a sense, how political ideas, content, and other kinds of content play out in social media, so that as a species, our natural critical faculties are more awakened, so that we're, as if you like, as consumers and as citizens, we are more broadly aware of the risks, the potential for being misled, the potential presence of bad actors, as well as the benefits of digital. Is that any part of the solution? It's a much softer idea than legislation. But again, the broader point that it may be that attempts at punishment and prevention may not entirely solve a problem when so much human behavior is being unlocked by these devices. Does that make sense?
I'm a little bit less sanguine about the idea of consumer and family education, because the rate at which new types of data harvesting is occurring, it may not be realistic, and that's really where people have to hold government accountable to answer for this. And so I
don't think anyone would suggest this as an alternative
No.
to all the other measures. A bit more is whether it's a way of completing the picture of a societal level response to this threat. But
I worry about the shaming. I worry about the sense of, oh, am I not smart because I don't really know how this data collection is occurring? That's not what this is about. Obviously, you want to keep your eyes open, and trust is declining, but it really is incumbent upon demanding action from regulators and lawmakers.
But this is a very good inspiration. I will be thinking about it, because this is maybe neglected, and I am responsible also for media, and I will have a chance
it'd be shorter to say what you're not responsible for.
To bridge the information from police and law enforcement world to the media, to have many more articles, which you showed us, because only only these tragic events have the potential to shake us and to think about it and read something about it and understand the risk for the children. So I will be thinking about.
Great. So I'm going to invite Kirstine Stewart on for closing remarks. Just before then, maybe you just thank this excellent panel, Vera, Rohit and Joanna. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Mark Thompson, as well for excellent moderation. This was obviously a very energetic conversation. Thank you very much. It's on an increasingly complex situation and issue. And I think as much as it was a great conversation, I think we can all agree that it's probably time for conversations to be over and for action to start to begin. And the benefit, I think, at the forum where at the platform where I am responsible for, the Media, Entertainment and Culture platform, we are working to bring together government, academia, business in order to come up with some collaborative solutions. And some of the conversations we're having here today have been very fruitful towards that. And we look forward to having many more and actually getting to some answers and to some proper solutions. So thank you so much to everyone. And thank you very much for coming.